I'm Valerie Steele, Director of the Museum at MFIT and Curator of Dance and Fashion. This exhibition is about the relationship between dance and fashion and how many fashion designers have been inspired by dance, and also how in recent years a number of dance companies have started asking fashion designers to create dance costumes for them. So we move from the 19th century all the way up to the present, and we'll see how designers like Christian Dior and Yves Saint Laurent have been inspired by different aspects of dance, and then how they have gone on to create dance costume as well. Now, those of you who are ballet fans knows that in the era of the Romantic Ballet, Monie Taglioni and Fanny Elster were the two great competing romantic ballerinas. This was Fanny Elster's dress from her most famous performance as the Spanish dancer. And of course, the poet Gautier talked about how Taglioni was, the Christian sublime dancer in her white dress, and Fanny Elster was the pagan dancer, very erotic. And this particular pink and black lace dress was almost as famous in its day as Taglioni's white dress with little wings. And you can see how it compares with dress from just slightly after the period. However, the key thing is that the ballet dresses were significantly shorter. But apart from that, you have your corseted top and your full skirt over petticoats. Another slightly later example of a 19th century ball gown. And again, you can see here with a sort of white, airy, sort of sylphide-like dress, which sort of is the quintessential look of a ballet dress. Here you can see how later in the 19th century you get the development of the classic sort of Russian imperial style ballet tutu, which is shorter and stiffer. This particular one is from New York City Ballet, and it was from Balanchine's Ballet Imperial. He had studied in St. Petersburg or Leningrad with the ballet there, and he worked with Karinska. So this then evokes all of the kind of glory of the Russian Imperial Ballet. Meanwhile, here we see a wonderful dress costume from Dance Theater of Harlem from Creole Giselle. Giselle being, of course, another one of the very important romantic ballets. And Dance Theater of Harlem then in the 20th century updated that from being set in medieval Europe to being set in the antebellum free South among a free black community. The history of the ballet goes back to the Renaissance and particularly to 17th century France. And there's been a tremendous growth in interest in Baroque music and dance in recent decades. So here we find a reconstruction of a Baroque man's dance costume. And in the beginning, the male dancers were as important as the women. By the time you reach the period of the Romantic Ballet, men are being pushed to the side, and a lot of people are even talking about how they don't want those male dancers on stage. They talk about them as being ugly. They should be dressed in military uniforms, writing laws, or carrying guns instead of dancing on the stage. Male dancers did then have a renaissance, of course, in the 20th century, beginning with Nijinsky and then continuing, of course, with people like Nureyev, whose costume this is, and Baryshnikov, whose costume that is. But whereas women's dance costume had a tremendous influence on fashion and drew from fashion, men's ballet costume did not. We also have an evening gown, not a ballet costume, but an evening gown worn by Margot Fonteyn. And I have to tell you that her waist was so small we had to put it on a 19th century mannequin with a corseted waist. Now, leotards also began to come in as rehearsal clothes, but it was a very, very long time before they went on stage. In the 1920s, there were a couple of experimental ballets where the dancers appeared on stage, and they talked in their memoirs about how mortified they were. They stayed dressed in their dressing gowns until the minute they had to pop out on stage in the leotards and tights. And they said, we understood we were supposed to look nude like classical statues, but we were just so mortified to be naked in front of everyone. But of course, particularly with New York City Ballet, the idea of leotards and tights being a particular kind of important ballet costume really took hold, to the point where some Fans of the New York City Ballet thought it was vulgar and unnecessary to have theatrical dance costumes. Why couldn't you do everything just in leotards and tights? And Balanchine himself was forever sort of simplifying and cutting down a number of dance costumes that didn't allow for the movement. Here we have Ralph Lauren, an ensemble which is inspired by rehearsal clothes. And we have a picture of Margot Fontaine rehearsing, wearing a similar little sweater top. We have the famous Rei Kawakubo biker ballerina ensemble for Comme des Garçons and the shoes that went with it. Another thing which I was thrilled to get from the Theatre and Dance Museum in Moulins, France, was this Christian Burrard dress from Symphonie Fantastique. Really priceless and beautiful dress. Burrard was a very close friend of Christian Dior, and his style of sort of romantic femininity really influenced Dior's new look. Karinska worked for him for a while in Paris, and you can see how her dress for La Valse is very much indebted to his sensibility. Diaghilev's Ballets Russes had an absolutely overwhelming impact on fashion in the early 20th century, particularly Scheherazade and some of the earlier Orientalist ballets. So we were delighted when we were able to acquire an actual man's costume from Scheherazade for the museum's permanent collection. And you can see with the full trousers, with the relative amount of body exposure, with a little bolero top, this had a huge impact. Suddenly, everybody saw themselves as members of the harem, and women were dressing up in harem pants and turbans with feathers, and they were throwing cushions on the floor and burning incense, and suddenly everything was Orientalist. Paul Poiret swore all up and down that he had not been influenced by boxed costumes for the Ballets Russes, but the historical evidence belies that claim. Here you see two more of boxed costumes for Scheherazade for women, and then Poiret, this is for a fancy dress party. Now, years later, Yves Saint Laurent was also very influenced by boxed costumes, and he did an entire Ballets Russes collection. Over here we see just in the costumes for one dance, Jewels by Balanchine, essentially three phases in the history of 20th century ballet. You have with Emeralds, looking back at the idea of the romantic ballet with the calf-length skirt, popularly referred to in fashion journalism as the ballet-length skirt. Then with Rubies, you have very jazzy, modern style, and sort of micro mini skirt. And then with Diamonds, again, looking back to the imperial Russian style. Here you see a Miuccia Prada being inspired by Josephine Baker and her notorious banana skirt that she wore at the Folies Bergère. And she, of course, also knew Balanchine and collaborated with him at one point. And here we have a section on the importance of the flamenco and the idea of Spanish dance and its impact on fashion. Here you have a real flamenco costume with the dots on it, which come from festival costumes in Sevilla. Then you have a Balenciaga. Being Spanish, he was very much drawn to this. You have a Schiaparelli, again focusing on the ruffled skirt, and notice her use of the color, because flamenco comes from the same root as flamingo, and another meaning is that it's red and fiery colored. Here you have this by the House of Paquin, and the designer at that point was also Spanish, friend of Balenciaga's. Here you have a Lacroix from later. It's more inspired by the south of France and Arles, but we'll come back to Lacroix later because he was a very theatrical fashion designer and couturier and has had a tremendous success designing for ballet and opera and theater subsequently. Balenciaga, Oscar de la Renta, and Ralph Lauren, again, all being inspired by flamenco, both in the sense of sort of Latin glamour and also in the sense of ruffles and the sort of bravura Spanish style. Now, we were unable to get an example of an Isadora Duncan ensemble. However, in the early 20th century, Isadora Duncan launched the first real challenge to the ballet that had a major impact on fashion and dance. She deplored the use of the cinched waist and the short tutu. She loathed ballet shoes. She thought you should be dancing barefoot, which had an enormous influence on modern dance. And so she was wearing various kinds of Grecian draperies, more or less skimpy, some very skimpy, others longer. She would occasionally have wardrobe malfunctions, which would get her to be banned from the stage in Boston, etc. But although she hated ballet, ballet dancers were very interested in her. And here you see a picture of Fokina, the Russian ballerina, wearing a costume which is clearly inspired by Isadora Duncan, and even appearing barefoot. Ordinary girls were also mad for Isadora Duncan's style and were forever running about in Grecian-style gowns. It had a major impact on high fashion, on people like Vianney. And here, so we have a 1920s American dress, very Isadora-inspired, and then a recent one by Albert Elbaz of Lanvin. Next, we move to sort of another great pioneering modern dancer, Martha Graham. And Martha Graham designed and made her own costumes throughout most of her career. And if ballet was all about legs, Martha Graham was really all about the pelvis and the torso. And so you can see with the costuming, she designs it so that you can be moving through the torso. And she's also very much interested in the expressive strength of fabric. So the skirt movements are very much a part of her choreography. Or in most extraordinary terms, you can see here where it's just a tube and the shape is entirely formed by the body moving within the tube of fabric. Highly avant-garde. Now, in her old age, Martha Graham was no longer able to sew, and her company was in big economic trouble. But Halston came in, was a big admirer of hers, and started creating costumes for her, saying, I want to be your hands. Here we have her own Clytemnestra costume, the one he made, another one that he made. Moving for a minute from modern dance to postmodern dance, Merce Cunningham asked Ray Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons to design his costumes after he had seen her famous bump collection. People called it monstrous and deliberately ugly. Made it somewhat difficult for the dancers to do certain moves, but the look was so intriguing. Moving back for a minute to modern dance, we have here several from Katherine Dunham, an African-American dancer and choreographer who was also a trained anthropologist, who did anthropological research in the Caribbean, particularly in Martinique, as well as in Haiti, and who drew on both the movements of Afro-Caribbean dance and also the costuming from there for her own work. So these are quite important pieces. Also in that same field, you have Alvin Ailey. And here you can see how he's adopted some elements from modern dance, such as the leotard, but then also, again, the very expressive skirts that reference back to Martha Graham, and the costuming that also evokes aspects of African-American heritage, like the sort of the church ladies' clothes and Revelations. Here you see Narciso Rodriguez, very well-known designer, always been known for his very body-conscious clothes, designing for Stephen Petronio, another contemporary modern dance choreographer. And then here, this is a Rick Owens from his famous fashion show last year, where instead of using fashion models, he brought in a troupe of steppers to do a stepping performance at the Paris runway show. When he did his collection, he made sure that he could have clothes that you could really move actively in for the performance. Now, this last part, with two exceptions, is all about fashion designers who've been asked to design for either modern dance or ballet. The two exceptions are two high fashion gowns by designers who were very interested in dance. The one in the back by Jeffrey Bean, who was on the board of American Ballet Theater, who was really obsessed with dance, and who often showed his fashion collections on dancers. And the other one, which is not a costume but a fashion, is here, the Black Swan ball gown by Christian Dior. Dior was really attracted to the ballet and frequently referenced it in his work. The little white mini dress with the black lacing is Yves Saint Laurent's 1965 costume for the Paris Opera Ballet, worn by the character Esmeralda in Notre Dame de Paris. And this, of course, looks absolutely 1965, with nothing medieval about it. It was a really wonderful. When Saint Laurent did this, then you start to see it growing over time. By the 1980s, there are more and more, and nowadays in the 21st century, an increasing number of designers are being asked to do this. Most fashion designers need a lot of help from a costume designer to figure out how to do it. But often they'll bring in something which will be new and different, unexpected. And that's what you're hoping for when you're getting a fashion designer in. We have a wide variety of dancers and choreographers. Here, for example, we have Isaac Mizrahi working with Twyla Tharp for Brief Fling. Here we have Norma Kamali, again working with Twyla Tharp. Here we have Versace, working for American Ballet Theater. And then also 2 yellow ensembles, the man also in the short yellow skirt, are also Versace. Versace, of course, was a very theatrical designer who had a tremendous influence and interest, in dance and in performance arts. He did a lot of opera costumes as well. Over here, we have Stephen Petronio by Tara Subkov, and she's kind of deconstructed the ballet tutu. Stella McCartney did this one here with a sort of tattoo-like bodysuit for Ocean's Kingdom, where her father did the music. This one was Prabal Gurung, and he did that for New York City Ballet, working with Justin Peck. They had to check with the dancers, was it okay to do those harnesses? And the dancers were like, yeah, we can move easily. These are a great example of what Mark Happel talked about, how he always has to explain to the fashion designers. The dancer is not walking down a runway. The dancer is not just an artist, she is an athlete. She'll be lifted up in the air, dancing around, thrown around, dragged around. And he said, and they have to do that every night for weeks. So the costume cannot fall apart on them. More in the way of the bodysuits with his tattoo-like motif. This, of course, Gautier, with the face mask as well. And Gautier, again, super dramatic, super expressive designer, and he's brought a lot of that into the costumes that he's done for dance. And here, Riccardo Tisci of Givenchy for Paris Opera Ballet, costuming for Bolero. So what he did here was to create costumes which have almost a sense of nudity with them, and also that the dancers would shed parts of the costume on the way, sort of like flowers losing their petals. So a very, very poetic and beautiful costume, which we were really keen on getting and had just been performed last year. Valentino, designing Bal de Couture for Peter Martins. Some of you probably remember how at least one reporter didn't like the red shoes, and saying the shoes really should be pink or they should be black. The red is distracting. It makes the feet look too big, which is kind of amusing when you think that the greatest ballet film of all time was The Red Shoes. And in fact, you see Fanny Elster wearing green shoes. In fact, in the 19th century, there were green and purple and red shoes as well, but those gradually faded out. The red tutu is, again, a Gautier for Ballet Les Rats, about the little ballet students. And it's very much a typical Gautier. It was a collaboration with Chopinet. And, well, the helmet, as long as it doesn't move, shouldn't be too much of a problem. But headdresses in general have been a problem for dancers. They're often something that designers will put in over the years. Artists were particularly prone to that in the 20s and 30s, 40s, having these headpieces, and the dancers tended to loathe them. Here we have a wonderful Lacroix from very early on, from his collaboration with Carole Armitage for the Paris Ballet. The red one, I'm sure you would guess instantly, is Valentino. It's exactly Valentino red and looks remarkably similar to many of the ball gowns that he did. We have one that was done for Mark Morris by Isaac Mizrahi and American Ballet Theater. It was Gong, which was inspired by Colin McPhee's gamelan-inspired music. There were a number of very bright colors, a sort of a ballet style, but then also little hints of gold referencing Balinese dance costume. This is really one of my very favorites. This is Iris van Herpen. Now, you know Iris is one of the most important couturiers working in Paris today. She's known for her very sculptural clothes, often very abstract and strange shapes. And she'd actually studied ballet for 14 years. So when she was asked to design for New York City Ballet, she had some idea what ballerinas would need. But she wanted to do something that was completely different from, as she said, the usual pink tutu. What she came up with was this brilliant design made of hundreds and hundreds of tiny pieces of plastic. They had to hire a computer expert to figure out how they could fit on the mesh so that she could move with them. Then she redesigned the point shoe, encasing it in this little zip-up boot, drawing attention to the curve of the calf and of the leg and the arch of the foot. The thing about fashion is, ideally, it's always bringing something new in. And that's obviously one of the reasons why dance companies want to bring in fashion designers, because it will bring something new to the aesthetic. Although the best or the easiest costume for a dancer is the thing that's closest to leotards and tights, the simplest, nevertheless, the fact that the visual allure of dance is so powerful, the right costumes can add considerably to giving a sense of the story, the emotion, the feel of the character and the dance. And so that's ultimately what we're sort of searching for when we look for fashion designers to help us create new styles for dance. Thank you so much.